our next keynote speaker, Professor Ruairi Glynn. Ruairi Glynn is Director of Interactive Architecture Lab at Bartlett School of Architecture, UCL. He is the founder and director of the Bartlett Masters in Design for Performance and Interaction. Alongside his teaching and research, he practices as an installation artist recently exhibiting at the Centre Pompidou Paris, National Art Museum of China, Beijing, and Tate Modern London. His interactive installations reflect on rapid development in robotics, material science, and computational technologies, examining the emerging aesthetics of behavior permeating across art, architecture, and design. Thank you, and we are looking forward for your presentation. Let's welcome Dr. Professor Ruairi Glynn.
Thank you very much. Okay, I've got lots of slides of lots of work, and I'm just going to jump straight in.
We are very delighted to see it. We are just want to see so many projects. Just
lots of videos, yeah, and just some fun to finish the day, I hope, and some ideas as well that we can discuss at the end.
Our audience
now, let's see.
Here for all day, so it will be like a festival right now. So
I hope so. Okay, let's see now if this works. If I share my screen now, can you see my name? And,
yeah, I can see your name and I can see the website.
Great. Okay. So
okay.
I will jump straight in, I guess. Thank you to those who have survived the whole day and made it to the end. I'm going to show you some work from the Interactive Architecture Lab at the Bartlett at University College London, which I direct. I'm going to show a bit about my own practice, and then I'm going to show you some student projects. Just to introduce the lab first, the Interactive Architecture Lab has been running now for almost a decade, and it follows in more than 2 decades further research before that at the Bartlett, and indeed decades and decades of research into active, reactive, and interactive architecture that has gone on in London, first and certainly the Architectural Association, and more recently at the Bartlett. This is a variety of videos of some of the work from the lab that I'll talk to you about. The work is highly interdisciplinary, working with the latest in technologies, working with people from a very wide variety of disciplines. Some of the work deals with intangible, tactile, situated, performative work, sonic environments. There's a deep fascination with materiality and the performance of material. And how space contextualizes that. We work a lot with movement and with light and with things that are just out of reach, but are still very much architectural in experience. We work with the latest developments in digital manufacturing and robotics, and harness a variety of the kind of amazing facilities that we have at University College London. This is some kinetic architecture built by actually some Chinese students of mine from a few years ago, trying to push it to the scale of inhabitable architecture. And we also look at the body as a site for performance and a site of interaction, and explore what an interactive architecture might be if it was worn. We explore varieties of novel, artificial, augmented, and virtual visual systems, and a variety of novel forms of interaction. The space that we have developed this work is a new building, and we've developed a new master's program alongside a variety of other interdisciplinary master's programs at the Bartlett that are trying to get architects working outside of the traditional boundaries of the discipline of architecture. And so this means building a very unique facility, and these are just some three-dimensional scans of LiDAR scans that show this magnificent warehouse space that we took over and filled with a vibrant interdisciplinary research group of engineers and architects and designers and biologists. You can see the robotics and workshop facilities, an auditorium in the center, and then at the front, where we have some daylight, we have studios for students and staff. And in this facility, there are a variety of laboratory spaces that allow us to conduct architectural research at large scale, which is really the most interesting aspect of this new building, is that we're really able to explore things at the scale of architecture, which we weren't able to do when we were based in central London. And so these are just some video footage of that facility. This is some of the digital fabrication tools, CNC and facilities and welding bays that contrast then maybe some of the more the latest developments in robotics, a black box for performance work, and so on. So I just wanted to contextualize this a little bit. We've talked about it all day, so I don't feel like I need to do too much, but this is just to say that my conception and the way that we think about the Interactive Architecture Lab is to think about interaction at all these scales, from the things that we wear to the buildings. And we don't really think about it as just being the provision of buildings, but actually about every atom of that building being potentially active and intelligent in some way. We're also interested in the things that might move around the city, so that whether it's drone technology or whether it's some kinds of strange living or semi-living technologies. Oops, I just lost my, can you see me? Can you hear me still? Apologies. Can you hear me there? Just want to confirm somebody can hear me.
I can hear you. I can hear you. I can see you, but now I can't see your desktop. I only see your desktop. Oh no. Okay, I can see your presentation. Okay.
Sorry. Yeah. A message popped up in Chinese, and I pressed OK, and it closed everything down. I didn't know what it actually said.
It's okay. Let's continue.
Okay. Let's continue. So yes, as I was mentioning, we're also interested in the things that might move through and occupy the city alongside human agency. And so this is where drone technologies and all sorts of strange artificially intelligent technologies or artificially living systems might start to create new types of aesthetics, new types of interactions as well. We're obviously very, very familiar with developments in automated cars by now. That's obviously going to have a profound impact on the city. So we're interested in like all these kinds of scales of thought, but then also this digital layer, which might sit on top of the physical architecture. So the kind of augmented and virtual worlds that might actually start to hybridize the physical spaces that we occupy. This is the work of Kechi Matsuda, a graduate from the Bartlett. This is some footage of students also experimenting with the public, interacting with VR environments. So this is the kind of things that we are interested in on a day-to-day basis. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about my personal kind of process of getting to develop my own practice, and how that practice led to the creation of a dedicated master's program and research lab at the Bartlett. And I'll spend about 20 minutes on this, so I can, maybe a little bit longer, just so that I can spend just as much time showing you some work from the lab and also some time for some questions. The first thing I wanted to say is that I've always had a kind of childish fascination with making things that move. And so I've always had this kinetic, mechanical fascination. And what I found really reassuring as I stepped into the world of architecture was that the oldest surviving literature that we have in Western literature that we have on architecture actually makes a point of recording and celebrating machine making as a part of architectural practice. And I think at some point in the history of architecture as a discipline, this idea got lost. But the ancient notion of the architect as a sort of artist and engineer was also a designer of machines, whether it was water organs, whether it was some kind of civil engineering projects to move water around a city, or whether it was a mobile war machine, or whether it was actually something that performed. And so Vitruvius mentioned or discusses the idea that an architect might be designing something that delights our senses, our eyes and our ears. And this idea that the architect is not just the maker of a sort of space of occupation or shelter, but was the architect would also be the designer of a performance that would start to stimulate and create this kind of pleasurable experience that would be quite, unique. And this idea of the performative machine as a form of architectural practice comes all the way through my work, and then into the work, I think, the students as well. And the reason that I think performativity is important, why I think performance is important, is because as you start to build an architecture that moves and responds, it is intrinsically performance. In the same way that any movement of a human interaction with another human is a performance of sorts. And so I developed, as a student, and then into a sort of arts practice, I developed my own ability to work with robotics, to work with the digital manufacturing tools that we have at the Bartlett, to build my own machines. And I didn't have an engineering background. I was an interaction designer, and then studied architecture. And so all of this kind of came, my access to this world came actually through the architectural training that I'd had, and also the training I'd had as an interaction designer. So it was looking at, I was using architectural tools to draw and then assemble things. I was using some of the coding skills that I'd got to bring these things I made to life. And all of this came from, like I'm saying, from an arts kind of approach, not from a sort of class, a conventionally kind of computer science or mechanical engineering background. And that was quite unusual at the time, this being in sort of mid 2000s. But this is a work that came a bit later. This was a commercial project that I did, where where you can see the film very much celebrates the craft and the traditional processes of making physical space, combined then with the construction of a custom-built robot, with which held this light source that moved around inside of a copper ring structure that we assembled in the center of this church space in central London. And the idea of the light is that it moves around inside of the sculpture, projecting light through the text that is cut out all the way around the sculpture, and that text is then projected onto the walls of the environment around it, to create this kind of deep immersive space, a sort of almost a haunted space. So this is a sort of idea of breaking away from the screen and creating interaction in physical space. It's somewhere between the world of architecture and art and performance, and that's the space that I work in. Of course, at the Bartlett, we're using a lot of robotics to explore construction methods. And this is actually also some of the work that I've been involved in. But for today, I'm not going to talk about this. I want to use the time that we have to talk about interaction. And Henry's spoken a great deal about it, and I'm not going to cover it in that detail, but I wanted to share just one quote that had an influence on me as a young designer, over a decade ago, that was from Paul Pangaro, who talked about how most modern interface design doesn't really involve interacting at all, but it's more like command line instructions dressed up in drag. So what he means by dressed up in drag is a lot of contemporary interaction design is really just putting lots of lipstick and makeup on top of a model of interaction that's very old. And it's very much a constrained computer science inspired notion of interaction, which is a command line technology. It's effectively a master slave model, which means that I tell the machine to do something and it does what I want it to do. And as a designer, that didn't interest me very much. And so I think my whole kind of career has been about pushing against this this very narrow notion of what interaction is. I would argue that this isn't interaction, actually. This is at best sort of reactive design. So an image that had a kind of profound influence when I was first considering this, and I should say, I'm actually going to, as I know I'm speaking to a lot of students, I'm actually going to show you some really early work of mine that was my entry point into this world, from almost 2006, 2007, so 15 years ago now. at least, that this is some early thoughts that helped shape my thinking, and then I'll bring you into where we are more contemporary. So some of this might seem a little bit old now, but I think it's useful to bring you through my mental process, because I think these questions are actually coming up today. So I was thinking, I don't want to use this kind of command line master-slave model. I want to explore how human-to-human interaction models might imagine a more dynamic architecture that enters us into a kind of dance of sorts. And so this image I liked very much because you can tell what it is, but what's really unique about this image is that they've got these little light sources on the end of the swords of the fencers, and the light source shows us the movement over time of each of these fencers, both trying to achieve their goal, which is to hit their competitor. And so I see each of these human beings as participants in this interaction. And I think that in the traced lines that capture this, 1 second in time, I think we see a little bit of interaction, perhaps at the very top of the image, where we have this sudden wiggle in the motion of that line. And for me, that wiggle is a moment of adaptation by one of the fencers. And there are other wiggles below, and what they all represent are these moments of thought, these moments of action, the moments of observing their effect, and then adapting, and then acting again, and then observing their effects and acting again. As Henry talked about it, this kind of narrative that unfolds, this performance that unfolds. And that each action has an influence on the next action, and that the history of those interactions, leads us to the moment that we're in. So it's really about this notion of adaptation and a history of exchanges that creates, in my view, a true form of interaction. And I like this idea as a sort of model for how we might think about an architecture that might interact with us. And so to find a way to build an architecture that might be able to do things like this, I went to looking at robotics, which is and cybernetics before it, which is where there's a great deal of theory around the idea of robots that can learn and change their behavior over time. And this is an example of a piece that I really loved, which was this biologically inspired machine behavior, where by Hod Lipson and his team, where they did not program this starfish-shaped robot to move. It developed its own strategies for movement using this generative techniques. And then what's really interesting is when they pull one of the legs off the robot is able to adapt, changing its performance to its new condition. And also what's interesting is also if you put it on different surfaces, so if it was on grass or if it was on rocks or if it was on ice, you can imagine that the robot might start to learn to skate or to climb or to kind of swim through something. And so I got really interested in the idea that we might be able to build machines that could evolve their behavior over time through interaction with their environment and people. Now, just this image as a starting point for me brought me to one of the very first robot that I ever built. So I wanted to share this with you. It's a kind of funny video made as a student, and it's where everything kind of went wrong, but I learned something anyway. So this is me in the basement of the Bartlett in 2006. And I just built this machine and it suddenly burst into life and was swinging around wildly. And you can see I'm kind of frightened by it actually. And I'm kind of trying to duck its movements, trying to reach out to switch it off. And I didn't program it to do any of that. Actually, what had happened was that the analog sensor that was disconnected, and the static electricity in the environment, which is kind of random, was actually being detected by the controller, and it was feeding in this random data into the robot, which was then creating it, making it swing around wildly. And you can see how frightened I am. And what you don't hear in this video though is that I burst out laughing at the end, and there was this just sense of like, wow, that was something. Like that was not what I expected. And it led me on to build a variety of machines that had this kind of liveliness These were machines that would wake up, look around their environment, and start performing these little dances with their tails. These are these little random performances. And they would look to find people to perform to. And when they found somebody, the dance would begin. And while they were dancing, they would be looking at the observer to see if they had kept our attention. So each performance was a little code, a little genetic code. And the most successful performances that kept people's attention survived. And this is using some old facial recognition software, which now is very easy to do. You can literally buy it for like £50. You can buy a little sensor to attach. I've got one right next to me, so I just picked it up. You can just buy these sensors now and plug them into an Arduino. But back then it was pretty tricky to do these things and involved networking computers and all sorts of things. But anyway, these robots each individually would evolve their behavior over time, and their performances would develop over the course of the exhibition. And so these robots competed for attention with the public, but then when people would leave the installation, they would turn to each other and perform to each other, teaching each other what they had learned. So they became a kind of community of artificially living agents that would occupy this environment and try and evolve their kind of aesthetic properties over time. And so there's kind of two things I want to take away from this to develop this lecture. One was that was this idea of liveness or liveliness that's in the title of my talk, which is that when we build things that sense the environment and become responsive to us, that a certain perception of being alive appears in them. And I'm sure this morning with the lectures you had from Philip Beasley, these ideas would have also have appeared. But this quality of liveness is something quite different to how we experience most architecture, which is, static predominantly or very slowly responsive. But the quality of liveness became something that deeply struck me. And the other thing that was interesting that this image represents is I did an exhibition of the work in Brazil. It ran for 3 or 4 months to hundreds of thousands of visitors. And when I came back to take the robot, to deinstall the robots who'd been living in the gallery, the people who worked there, I had found, had named each of the robots and would talk about each of their individual personalities in quite a lot of detail. And I found it really interesting that people had developed a sort of emotional relationships and perceived these as emotional objects in a deep way, and were happy to talk to me about it. And this kind of imagination that we have has followed with me, and it led me on to a PhD and develop a certain practice of outside of architecture to understand how my work affects people. So this is working with Ronnie Ledru, who's a very well-known puppeteer in the UK. And he was a traditional puppeteer and I was building robots, and we were having these kind of conversations for a number of years, and he was advising me, and it was just great, really interesting to work with a traditional puppeteer. And then I was also, through the PhD, able to explore the worlds of perceptual psychology. So this is really early perceptual research into how we perceive intelligence in the motion of simple objects. And at the same time, I was fascinated by the aesthetics of the aesthetics of early experimental animation and mobile art and kinetic art and so on. And then the work of, the people like Oskar Schlemmer and the Bauhaus, and how they were trying to animate architecture through the use of costume and performance as a way of prototyping a future kinetic architecture. And just as and I think and then it led me to a series of kinetic abstract pieces of work. So the first one is this, this is the Picasso gallery at the Centre Pompidou. There's a painting in the back on the right that we were building this as a response to, and we built this piece, the Motive Colloquies, as a kinetic responsive installation within the gallery for basically a kind of takeover of the gallery, which is traditionally showing these paintings by Picasso, but was now asking artists to come in and reinterpret the work. So I was using this this kind of abstract language as a sort of reference to the painting you see in the background. And the behaviors of this machine were, rather than a sort of evolving over many months in the gallery, as this show was only for a single night, this robot was very simple and it was copying people's movements. So you see, as this person moves towards it, it kind of copies them back. And as people get close, it pushes right up in their face as well. So it's really, really mirroring and kind of mimicking in a very abstract way, which really creates a very strong sense of connection, which is kind of surprising. You can see here how subtle movements are translated into the machine. And so this brought another opportunity for me then. So this is another gallery space, a very large one in the Tate in London. And I wanted to bring the abstract, very abstract, simple model into this space, but I wanted to be able to move around this large environment. And so I built a large 21-meter motorized rail, and then a custom robot. You can see them. On the left-hand side was the quarter-scale robot, and then on the right-hand side you see the full-scale robot, which was then put on the motorized rail, which allowed it to move through the gallery. So and then the head that was on this was this illuminated tetrahedron. Again, this abstract form that would float just above people's heads, and I was able to sense people in the environment through an array of depth sensing cameras. So this is just a little video of the install of that work. This is a video made by the BBC. As you can see, BBC were capturing our install, which was great because it was a very busy install in a single day and overnight. So we installed a motorized rail, we hung this large scale robot from the ceiling, and then we turned the lights off. So nobody saw any of the technology at all, but rather they just saw this floating lights tetrahedron. And so if you stood underneath it motionless, it would kind of hover above you, barely moving. But as soon as you started to move, it would mirror and respond to your motions. And so it encouraged people to play with it, and of course, children were particularly entertained by it. But it did sort of bring people into a sort of performative space where you had the people at the center, and then you had these kind of audiences around it. So people were kind of taking turns. Some were getting close, some were hiding away in the back. And it had a number of behaviors to do with running away, little playful ones where it would swing around people. But I think one of the most important things to understand is that when people entered into the space, they didn't know what they were coming to see. And they just saw this very dark room with this humming sound. And then as they came in, they'd see this light, strange light moving. And as they got closer, they'd start to see people, and then they may interact with it. So fortunately, the BBC actually interviewed some of the public who came to see the show. So I've got a nice little video that gives you a bit of a sense of how the public responded to it.
It reminded me of being in one of those scary films.
It reminded me of one of those dreams you have, when aliens sort of invade the Earth, and it seemed something like that. The triangle light came on and it appeared to be following people.
It kind of creeped me out how it knew how people were standing and where to go.
You could see the reactions of all the other people. They weren't quite sure what was going on.
You expect something a bit scary, but then, I don't know, its movements are kind of organic, and I don't know, it seems very friendly.
So I love that what that last person says there. But I find it really interesting that some people are quite scared, and then as they come closer and they start to interact, they start to actually have a very different emotional experience with it. And my favorite image from the exhibition is this image of a parent lifting up, I guess, their child to reach out, and it talks to a sort of human need for contact or intimacy. And it's a sort of just that sense of connectivity, connection, emotional connection is really important. It's actually a very dangerous thing to do, to lift your child into the path of a moving robot. But anyway, nobody was harmed, I'm glad to say, and and it was a great success. That was an art project, but I've show you one or two commercial projects that I've also been doing at the same time, which also are more, I would say, within an architectural framework. The first one is, and this begins with a bit of a video of the install of a project which I did as a collaboration with my friends Almanac Architects. So we basically built a grid of LED balls. This just shows the setup for the work, lots of wiring, lots of cables. And you can see that we're using truss technology, we're using lighting systems. We're actually using a lot of theater-based technologies to do this. And this is just capturing the install that took place in one day. And the result of that is this kinetic, piece, this kind of kinetic sculpture that rises and falls inside of the building. But this is actually just what I would call a kind of polite lobby art. There's many corporate buildings where they like to have pretty things in them. But what I was really interested in was bringing this technology into this building and having a conversation with the people who work there, because this is the headquarters of Arup Engineers. They're the UK's largest leading civil engineering company. Lots of architects there, lots of engineers, lots of clever people. And I was able to organize workshops where we actually shared the software that we had built to run the kinetic sculpture. We shared it. We had like an online source you could download. You could learn with us how to program it, and people were able to hack the installation and customize it. And so this is just a few examples of what people did. This is an engineer who took a little hand tracking sensor, a Leap Motion. They were able to track the movement of their hands, and just by the gestures and movements of their hands, this is 6 stories up now, plugging in their software, and suddenly now by moving their hands, they can control the movement of all the balls, like almost puppeteering this surface above the people who work there. And there's a very wide variety of experiments there, but the point was we open sourced the system so that anybody in the building could hack it, and that was kind of an interesting project. We also collaborate a lot with other people. So this is a research we did developing a prototype installation where we were looking at laser projection combined with robotics to be able to create animated virtual spaces, but in physical space. So we were using laser projection on servo motors to be able to project different kinds of geometry into space. And these forms that we built then led to a much larger piece by our collaborators, Marshmallow Laser Feast. So you can see this is a large piece, outdoor work that was presented a couple of years ago in London for a culture festival. And now we were able to build the same sculpture, but truly at the scale of a large building. This actually was visible throughout the east of London. So it was amazing to take something small developed in the lab and actually bring it to the scale where it could be witnessed by millions of people from their windows. Okay, so that is the background, I think, to bring you into the where we are now and the work that I'm doing at the Bartlett, where I founded the Design for Performance and Interaction Master's Program, based around a few ideas that I think might have already been expressed in the work that I showed you of my own. And one is this idea that we can create spaces for performance, and that we can also at the same time create the performances within them, and that this is a process that's symbiotic. And so the spaces that I was creating and the technologies within them that create sort of performative interactions with the public is a kind of holistic approach to design. The architect is not just the designer of the exhibition space or the designer of the theater space, but also the designer of the performance that occurs inside of it, or the art inhabitants and so on. And this is just a photo of 4 of the students looking very happy. So I like this photo because it's good to have happy students. When we developed the program, we worked actually with a bunch of London's leading interactive architecture firms, including companies like Stewfish, who they build large-scale kinetic and stage shows. This is just one of the pieces that one of the works I really love for U2 looks a bit like some of the things that the Archigram were doing back in the 1960s. Stufish, so the idea that architects could go on to become stage designers, to go on to choreograph performances was certainly something that we'd gained a lot from them. We also worked with companies like Jason Brood Studio, who embed particularly lighting technologies into public spaces that are active, sometimes reactive, and maybe a little bit interactive as well. This is actually a very modest piece, but it's a piece that I really like by them, which are these shadowy or kind of ghostly figures that exist on a platform, on a virtual platform on the other side of this physical platform. So while people are stood waiting for a train, they can see these little, these almost like the train station is dreaming about people who've been there before and the kind of memories of people who come and go. And then this is, the subtlest examples of work, but then there's the more dramatic, which is an example of a viral campaign. This was a UFO flown over central London, literally flown over the Tower of London. That was a viral campaign. So our friends at Cinema Studio developed this as a way to advertise a game. Those of you who are gamers will recognize Halo signature of it. But the point being is that there's a very large kind of commercial space for interactive architecture as well. So we're interested in bringing people into that space. And then, of course, we also work with performance artists. This is New Movement Collective, who combine architecture, digital media, and dance to create really unique and dramatic shows. And some of the people in this collective now actually teach on the program and have done workshops and have collaborated with us. So we work very closely with them. And there's a variety of other companies that I won't have time to talk about, but we see ourselves as a sort of a space to bring people from different directions into a kind of big interdisciplinary conversation. So our team is really interdisciplinary, and people coming from backgrounds in architecture and in computer science, dance choreography, neuroscience, filmmaking, acoustics, digital art. Who else? Mechanical design, virtual reality research, robotics, theater, exhibition design. So we've got a really diverse group of tutors on the program, and that diversity is matched by the students that are also from a very wide variety of backgrounds. So this is just a video of the kinds of materials that we work with, which is very broad and not always digital, but a kind of combination of physical and digital. So I think this idea about how, although we're working with interactive architecture, we're often, when we're working with students, we're working, at least in the early stages, with small scale prototypes. We're exploring a very wide variety of materials and the way that materials perform, as much as thinking about the digital control of performance as well, and whether it's virtual or robotic or whatever it might be. So it's really this real mix of senses and media that's at the heart of the program. So I'm going to show you some work that expresses a whole bunch of different ways that we go at this. So this is the work of a student who actually was an architect by training, but had actually also been a dancer and had basically worked all day as an architect and then gone to dance classes every night because she loved dance, but had chosen architecture over dance, but still loved dance. Many of us have to make that decision when we go to university, when we might actually have other passions. And architecture is often a space of people with this kind of, a sort of wishing to find a sort of professional space for work, but actually have a sort of deep fine art or performance background. So we find those students and we create a space for them to work. And so this is an example of a student who was looking at body tracking technologies and how she could track her movements through space, those could be transformed into paths, and that this robot arm would start to assemble those paths and then hand them to her, who she would then assemble in the space. And as she danced through the space, this space would grow, that more and more parts would be made, and the sculpture would build as she performed and as the machine performed. And so there's this kind of feedback loop between the performer and the robot, and then the kind of performance of the space itself, which as this space becomes more complex, increasingly starts to influence the movements that this student is able to make. So this is an example of the kind of where, you know, dance met architecture, met robotics. And the way that we introduce students to robotics is through this very hands-on process of iteration. So this is Charlie, he's a student from China. He's doing some face tracking that controls this robotic rig, and it's controlling magnetically these ferrofluidic eyes. And then he was using magnetism as well to control these frames on a wall. And then we put the magnets behind the wall on a robot arm, which allowed us to be able to move the frame around the wall. And then we brought this work out into the public. So this is the frame actually interacting with the public at an art festival. And so you can see how, you know, something as simple as a picture frame can be using these technologies, both advanced digital technologies and, you know, maybe, you know, using magnets is sort of a very 19th century sort of technology in the theater. But using this combination of 19th century and 21st century technologies together to create something unique and playful. There was a question earlier on about soft robotics. And so I put a video in about, this is a project that was very much a body-based project, but it's looking at using soft robotics on the body to be able to experience space in a new way. So this is a series of wearable parts that sense the environment. So as you get closer to these inflatable parts, they inflate and they actually compress your neck or your skin. And the idea is that you scan the environment, and then as somebody walks around, they can actually sense the environment using these these soft robotic materials. And so this idea that we might be able to experience, you can imagine this being used by people with vision problems or with people in emergency situations like firemen in a smoky environment. So we're exploring this idea of a technology that would allow us to sense space in a new way. And then that project was extended into a sort of speculative realm later by looking at what would a future, you know, beyond the screen look like if soft robotics became the technology through which we felt and sensed digital data in our physical environment. So this is a performance piece that's expressing a sort of, you know, a sort of post-digital fluidic future for design. A few more examples. And I think just to kind of, I think the overall message is that there's a very wide variety of, you know, of ways of working, and we enjoy that. This is a project that looks at measuring using little sensors. We're able to measure plants' response to various environmental conditions, moisture, sunlight, pollution. And we built a garden that lives inside of a sphere, and that this sphere is actually, by moving the garden, individual garden nodes, is actually able to roll, and in rolling is able to actually move potentially around a natural environment. And I know that often in architecture, these things remain as a sort of physical, as a digital representation, but we really believe in building these things. So we built ourselves this geodesic sphere with these robotic gardens that can sense their environment and move around. This was the old Bartlett building. You can see the robot kind of walking around on the path outside, rolling around. And then this is it in the bus lane on the road down from Camden. So we were imagining what it would be like if we started to give, you know, a mobile agency to plants, and would they be able to go search the city for more suitable environments for them to plant? Would they be able to find microclimates for them to be most happy in? Would they be able to, respond to changes in pollution and so on, and support and protect these species? And also, it's again speculative, but also imagining what it would be like for a future architecture that sensed its all the living systems that were part of it or within it. And now for something again very different. This is now work in the lab that was exploring virtual reality. Because we have a dance choreographer and neuroscientists in the program, we have a quite a critical view around a lot of VR work that is very much about sitting in a chair and kind of looking around. It's very disembodied, or it doesn't encourage you to move, and you lose the sense of your own body in it. So this is a project where you're on this platform that's shifting, and then there's this virtual world that you can see through your movements, and then there are these balls that run around your body that you can hear shifting the weight and the sound around the body. So it's very much still a tactile, physical, haptic experience, even though your experience is virtual world. So what we're trying to do is create not a virtual reality, but a mixed reality. And this is sort of performative expression of that world that we'd like to try and build towards. And then we do work that's really of the kind of, directly in the performance domain that deal with, spaces that are, and would often with a lot of random and material performance. So this is a piece by Parker Hale that's a kinetic artwork that is both digitally controlled, but embraces the wobbles and the material, the flexibility and the gravity and the qualities of these mirrored ladders, Jacob ladders. And so it's a really lovely expression of a very simple idea. And he's gone on to bring this to a variety of international exhibitions. And it's this this idea that we're always working at the threshold between the digital and the physical in the work, and that you don't want to lose the physical. You don't want to forget about the way that materials perform. And he's kind of celebrating that, while at the same time it being this kind of still a very digital project in other ways. I'll share a little video, and then I want to finish up so there's time for questions, last 15 minutes, or last 10, 15 minutes. This is just some of the students talking about their experience.
My name is Dalia Chaudhary Michael. My background is landscape architect, so I came into this course to explore, concepts of performance in public space and in public art.
My name is Kyuyan, and my background lies in stage design. I want to join the program because I want to design for performance in a new perspective. The interaction really speaks to my mind.
My background is in design engineering. I joined the course to get more skills in the interactive design aspect.
The reason I decided to come here is to merge architecture, design, dance, performance, acrobatics, and circus. So it was a great opportunity for me to express my interest. My project is an interactive performance that its aim is to connect the audience members with the dancer through haptic technologies. The audience members are able to feel in real time what the dancer is feeling and receive the stimuli and all the sensations that the dancer is producing through wearable technologies.
We're making a game out of reconfigurable robots. We call it Hugo. So you can interact with robot by changing the environment, and they're going to respond to your change and play game with you.
Our project is Sounds and Sweet Airs. It's questioning about human and environment relationship, how we remember our past environment in this environment that we're living in.
My project is called Lumina. It's a light installation that aims to generate some sense of presence by exploring some body movement, and the user is able to modify the color, the shape, and the intensity of the light. What I loved about these masters the most, it was the wide range of fields that we were able to explore.
I really enjoyed meeting people from different backgrounds and collaborating with them and actually working on projects and learning how each discipline has different things to offer.
What I really appreciated from my tutors, it was to give me this ability to do something that it was me and add some meaning to me.
The introduction to coding was very, very intense, but very interesting to see how the code that we were developing visually works. That was probably the most challenging, but most fulfilling thing during the whole course.
I had to learn so many new things, and I had to put everything together and push myself into my boundaries and to the limits of what I want to achieve and what I want to do.
My advice for the new students would be to not be scared of not being capable of doing something.
Get in the workshop, get building as soon as possible, and make a lot of mistakes because that's the things you learn the most from.
The main thing is that you need to really like what you are doing, and you're gonna overcome all the problems.
Take a challenge and don't sit in your comfort zone because you get a lot more done when you're challenging yourself.
Okay, I'm just going to finish by just letting you know that if you go to interactivearchitecture.org, you can see all the lab projects worked by me, by the researchers there, and also by the students. So it's a great place if you want to check out a little bit more. And I'm going to finish there just so we have some time for some questions. But thank you very much for sticking with me at the end of the conference. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have.